Hi, students. So normally, if you were to miss out on a lesson, we would have a recording of our Teams meeting that we held this morning so that you could get caught up on the reading lesson that you missed. However, this morning we were having some technical difficulties, and so I am going to include this video that I am now recording here in my classroom. And I am going to read for you and kind of talk about this text. It's titled A Bad Case of the Stripes. It's written and illustrated by David Shannon. When we discussed as a class, we first started and we looked at the front cover and we said, I would probably assume or make an inference based on what I see here on the front cover that this book is not very serious, but maybe like a funny story. Some students said they think it's funny because the character's painted in these bright rainbow colored stripes. When I had students in the past, a student said, well, they think it might be serious because she has a thermometer in her hand and she looks rather sick and she looks like she has a cup, like maybe something she's drinking, and they're assuming or they're making the inference that she's probably in bed and not feeling well. So both of these inferences are very valid because you've used evidence from the illustration to support your inference. So I'm going to share my screen with you and I'm going to read aloud this text and we're going to, talk about it once we finish reading it together. Camilla Cream loved lima beans, but she never ate them. All of her friends hated lima beans and she wanted to fit in. Camilla was always worried about what other people thought of her. Today, she was fretting even more than usual. It was the first day of school and she couldn't decide what to wear. There were so many people to impress. She tried on 42 outfits, but none seemed quite right. She put on a pretty red dress and she looked in the mirror. Then she screamed. Her mother ran into the room, and she screamed too. "Oh, my heavens!" she cried. "You're completely covered with stripes." This was certainly true. Camilla was striped from head to toe. She looked like a rainbow. Mrs. Cream felt Camilla's forehead. "Do you feel all right?" she asked. "I feel fine," Camilla answered. "But just look at me." "You get back in bed this instant," her mother ordered. "You're not going to school today." Camilla was relieved. She didn't want to miss the first day of school, but she was afraid of what the other kids would say, and she had no idea what to wear with those crazy stripes. That afternoon, Dr. Bumble came to examine Camilla. "Most extraordinary," he exclaimed. "I've never seen anything like it. Are you having any coughing, sneezing, runny nose, aches, pains, chills, hot flashes, dizziness, drowsiness, shortness of breath, or uncontrollable twitching?" "No," Camilla told him. "I feel fine." "Well, then," Dr. Bumble said, turning to Mrs. Cream, "I don't see any reason why she shouldn't go to school tomorrow. Here's some ointment that should help clear up those stripes in a few days. If it doesn't, you know where to reach me." And off he went. The next day was a disaster. Everyone at school laughed at Camilla. They called her Camilla Crayon and Night of the Living Lollipop. She tried her best to act as if everything were normal. But when the class said the Pledge of Allegiance, her stripes turned red, white, and blue, and she broke out in stars. The other kids thought this was great. One yelled out, "Let's see some purple polka dots." Sure enough, Camilla turned all purple polka dotty. Someone else shouted, "Checkerboard!" And a pattern of squares covered her skin. Soon everyone was calling out different shapes and colors, and poor Camilla was changing faster than you could change channels on a TV. That night, Mr. Harms, the school principal, called. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cream," he said. "I'm going to have to ask you to keep Camilla home from school. She's just too much of a distraction. And I've been getting calls from the other parents. They're afraid those stripes may be contagious," meaning other people might catch it. Camilla was so embarrassed. She couldn't believe that 2 days ago everyone liked her. Now Nobody wanted to be in the same room with her. Her father tried to make her feel better. "Is there anything I can get you, sweetheart?" he asked. "No, thank you," sighed Camilla. What she really wanted was a nice plate of lima beans, but she had been laughed at enough for one day. "Hmm, well, yes, I see," Dr. Bumble mumbled when Mr. Cream phoned the next day. "I think I'd better bring in the specialist. We'll be right over." About an hour later Dr. Bumble arrived with 4 people in long white coats. He introduced them to the Creams. "This is Dr. Grop, Dr. Sponge, Dr. Cricket, and Dr. Young." Then the specialist went to work on Camilla. They squeezed and jabbed, tapped and tested. It was very uncomfortable. "Well, it's not the mumps," concluded Dr. Grop. "Or the measles," said Dr. Sponge. "Definitely not chicken pox," put in Dr. Cricket. "Or sunburn," said Dr. Young. "Try these," said the specialist. They each handed her a bottle filled with different colored pills. "Take one of each before bed," said Dr. Grop. Then they filed out the front door, followed by Dr. Bumble. That night, Camilla took her medicine. It was awful. When she woke up the next morning, she did feel different, but when she got dressed, her clothes didn't fit right. She looked in the mirror, and there, staring back at her, was a giant, multicolored pill with her face on it. Dr. Bumble rushed over as soon as Mrs. Cream called, but this time, instead of the specialist, he brought the experts. Dr. Gord and Mr. Mellon were the finest scientific minds in the land. Once again, Camilla was poked and prodded, looked at and listened to. The experts wrote down lots of numbers, then they huddled together and whispered. Dr. Gord finally spoke. "It might be a virus," he announced with authority. Suddenly, fuzzy little virus balls appeared all over Camilla. "Or possibly some form of bacteria," said Mr. Mellon. Out popped squiggly little bacteria tails. "Or it could be a fungus," added Dr. Gord. Instantly, Camilla was covered with different colored fungus blotches. The experts looked at Camilla, then at each other. "We need to go over these numbers again back at the lab," Dr. Gord explained. "We'll call you when we know something." But the experts didn't have a clue, much less a cure. By now, the TV news had found out about Camilla. Reporters from every channel were outside her house, telling the story of the bizarre case of the incredible changing kid. Soon, a huge crowd was camped out in the front lawn. The Creams were swamped with all kinds of remedies from psychologists, allergists, herbalists, nutritionists, psychics, an old medicine man, a guru, and even a veterinarian. Each so-called cure only added to poor Camilla's strange appearance until it was hard to even recognize her. She sprouted roots and berries and crystals and feathers, and even a long furry tail, but nothing worked. One day, a woman who called herself an environmental therapist claimed she could cure Camilla. "Close your eyes," she said. "Breathe deeply and become one with your room." "I wish you hadn't said that," Camilla groaned. Slowly, she started to melt into the walls of her room. Her bed became her mouth. Her nose was a dresser, and 2 paintings were her eyes. The therapist screamed and ran from the house. "What are we going to do?" cried Mrs. Cream. "It just keeps getting worse and worse." She began to sob. At that moment, Mr. Cream heard a quiet little knock at the front door. He opened it, and there stood an old woman who was just as plump and sweet as a strawberry. "Excuse me," she said brightly, "but I think I can help." She went into Camilla's room and looked around. "My goodness," she said with a shake of her head, "what we have here is a bad case of stripes. One of the worst I've ever seen." She pulled a container of small green beans from her bag. "Here," she said, "these might do the trick." Are those magic beans? Asked Mrs. Cream. Oh my, no, replied the kind old woman. There's no such thing. These are just plain old lima beans. I'll bet you'd like some, wouldn't you? She asked Camilla. Camilla wanted a big, heaping plateful of lima beans, more than just about anything, but she was still afraid to admit it. Yuck, she said. No one likes lima beans, especially me. Oh dear, the old woman said sadly. I guess I was wrong about you. She put the beans back in her bag and started toward the door. Camilla watched the old woman walk away. Those beans would taste so good, and being laughed at for eating them was nothing compared to what she'd been going through. She finally couldn't stand it. Wait, she cried. The truth is, I really love lima beans. I thought so, the old woman said with a smile. She took a handful of beans and popped them into Camilla's mouth. Mmm, said Camilla. Suddenly, the branches, feathers, and squiggly tails began to disappear. Then the whole room swirled around. When it stopped, there stood Camilla, and everything was back to normal. I'm cured, she shouted. Yes, said the old woman, I knew the real you was in there somewhere. She patted Camilla on the head. Then she went outside and vanished into the crowd. Afterward, Camilla wasn't quite the same. Some of the kids at school said she was weird, but she didn't care a bit. She ate all the lima beans she wanted, and she never had even a touch of stripes again. Okay, so today, after our read aloud of A Bad Case of the Stripes, we opened up this PowerPoint and we were kind of talking about our character, Camilla, and her experience with this bad case of stripes. I asked the question, what did you guys think caused these stripes for Camilla, and then what makes you think that from the story? And the first person that I called on was Easton. And Easton told me that he believed that the stripes were caused by children and adults saying certain words. And I asked him, I said, well, Easton, what in the story made you think that? And he said, well, Mrs. Body, there was the part where the child called out checkerboard. And then if you remember what happened to Camilla, she turned into a checkerboard. So for some of us, maybe we were thinking something a little bit different, but he was able to provide text evidence that supported his thinking about why she was changing. I think when I asked that question, he was thinking more about how she continued to change. So then I talked to Mia briefly and I said, Mia, what are your thoughts? What caused her to have this, the stripes that appeared? And she said the stripes were caused from Camilla not eating the lima beans. So her thinking was a little bit different than Easton's. Then I asked her for some text evidence. Okay, well, can you support your thinking? What in the story makes you think that? And she told me Camilla loved lima beans. However, she was afraid to eat them and get made fun of. So I have two students, different reasons, but they were able to support their thinking about what's causing these stripes to occur. After that, we then went on to focus on this little cute old lady who appears at the end of the story. She's the one who then gives a few of the lima beans to Camilla, and she makes this statement, and you can see it right here. I knew the real you was in there somewhere. And I asked the question, what does she mean by that? And I talked to Julia, and Julia said that I think the old woman means that the real, Camilla would eat the lima beans. And then we talked about like what makes you think that. And we said basically that we know she loves lima beans, but she is afraid to do what she loves, meaning eat the beans. We also said that we know, or we read that the old woman gave her some lima beans, knowing that Camilla loves them, and watched as she turned back into herself. So again, good readers, they're providing evidence that supports their thinking. We were looking at another character in the story and their effect on our main character, Camilla. We then went on and we were talking a little bit about theme, and there's an anchor chart here that introduces just some common themes by topics. And I told you guys that theme is really a lesson that your author wants the reader to take away. Usually it can apply to other stories. It's not specific to that story or the characters. For example, a theme for this story would most likely not be that it's important to eat lima beans so that you don't turn different colors. That's not going to be our theme because that cannot relate to other characters and other life situations that we may encounter. So then I asked you guys if you would type in the chat what you think a possible theme might be. And the response that I got from a majority of students was that a possible theme could be that it is important to be yourself. Other students said people should not worry about impressing others and trying to be something different. Both of these are excellent answers. And again, hopefully you're able to provide that text evidence that, again, that when she was not true to herself, what happened? Well, she turned into all these different things. First it was stripes, and then it was like she turned into basically the American flag during the Pledge of Allegiance. And then she turned into a checkerboard and polka dots and then viruses, even when the doctors were telling her things, because she's so concerned with what other people think of her and not being true to herself that she then turns into those things. So this is kind of, boys and girls, where we left off after our read aloud, and these were the PowerPoint slides that we went through and we talked about together. So the last one that I want to look at is just a reflection on basically today's lesson. I'm going to read this for you, and hopefully you're still following along. It says, building a reading community requires you to think about how you're treating one another, how you're listening and speaking to one another, and how you are taking responsibility for your learning and behavior. So part of our discussion right now needs to focus around what went well and what do we still need to improve on. So I know now that perhaps filming videos like this and having it like you're working at your own pace, that might work better for some students. Live lessons do present challenges. So right now I want to focus on what were the things that went well. Well, we were able to log in on time and get started. We were able to participate. Other things that went well. We read through the entire text and responded to some, and we call these text dependent questions. Now, some things that maybe we need to improve upon might include the use of technology. It's very important, boys and girls, as we saw today, that when we enter, that our microphones are muted, just as a refresher and a reminder of those teams' expectations. Another area that might need improvement, something that I saw that was a little concerning, the chat. So the chat being used appropriately. The chat will be used so that I can hear back from students as we are going through a lesson, whether it's a live lesson that we're working in whole group or even in small group. The chat, boys and girls, is almost like if you were here in class and you were, let's say, passing a note around that had information on it, you probably wouldn't do that while your teacher was in the middle of like a reading or a math lesson. Just the same for the chat on Teams. Every time you type in something, it populates, meaning it comes up on my screen so that I can see what you are typing. Now that actually causes like very much so a distraction for me because I'm actually toggling through, meaning I'm working between like 3 to 4 different screens right here in front of me when we're providing a live lesson. So I'm very, very purposeful, and when I ask you to use the chat to type a response so that I can see, because I'm prepared for those responses to come up on my computer screen. When you're typing things like LOL or yawn or dog or hi everyone, and those are popping up in the middle of a lesson, it actually is very distracting for me. And more importantly, when things are being said about other students or to other students, that's not okay, and that's not an appropriate use of the chat box. So those are some areas we want to improve on. Tomorrow, my goal is that we can get started, and hopefully I will have a video for you where I walk you through a performance task. Basically, it's a written response that went along with this story, A Bad Case of Stripes. It's not very lengthy, but it's something similar to probably written responses you did in 3rd grade. So I hope this video helped, and I look forward to seeing you in reading tomorrow and in math later today.